Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. This is Chapter 2 of the Book 7. Episode 79, Into the White Silence. In the small town of Circle, Alaska, the owner of the general store received a radio transmission from Fairbanks, which he quickly relayed to the cell tower on Grizzly and Jack's property, and within minutes, the radio receiver in Jack and Sasha's living room crackled with static. All commercial flights from Anchorage to Fairbanks have been canceled due to the impending storm. We've just gotten word that a small aircraft has gone down somewhere approximately 100 miles north of Anchorage. 14 passengers and the pilot, Sam Anderson, were on board the plane when it went down. Search and rescue planes are grounded, but teams are preparing to head out just as soon as the storm lets up. Ground crews will begin mobilizing at first light. The voice on the radio was calm and professional, but the words sent a bolt of ice through Sasha's veins. She gripped the arm of the couch, her knuckles turning white. Grizzly was already on his feet, reaching for his coat. "I'm heading to the airfield in Fairbanks. Gotta find out what they know. I'll pick up Carl along the way." Sasha barely heard him. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stared at the radio, willing more information to come through. A small aircraft? 14 passengers? Jack and Miguel had been on a small plane. She swallowed hard. "I'm coming too." Not a word was spoken during the long drive into Fairbanks. Sasha stared out the window at the snowy landscape, willing Jack to be alive, pushing away the panic clawing at her throat. Grizzly stared ahead, his hands gripping on the steering wheel, his face carved from stone. He'd been through enough Alaskan winters to know what this meant. If they weren't already dead from the crash, then the cold would finish them off before long. Now, Grizzly kept his thoughts to himself. He knew the storm had meant visibility nearly zero, rendering it impossible to send out search and rescue helicopters. But did they at least have a sense of where the plane had gone down? Would it even be possible to send out trackers and ground teams, mushers? There were men out in that neck of the woods that knew the land better than anyone. You call the right people, and they'll head out before the damn slow as molasses government agencies can get their damn snowcats moving. He pursed his lips together and breathed in deeply, trying to calm the fear that threatened to take over. The truck's tires crunched over the packed snow as Grizzly eased onto the narrow logging road outside of Fairbanks, the headlights cutting through the swirling flakes. The storm had already begun settling in, and if the news about Jack and Miguel wasn't bad enough, the weather made everything feel even more ominous. Carl's cabin came into view, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness of the storm raging outside. It was a stark contrast to the icy dread curling inside Grizzly's guts. He didn't want to say the words out loud. He didn't want to make this any more real than it already was, but Carl needed to know. And more importantly, Sasha needed someone else in her corner before she broke apart completely. As soon as Grizzly killed the engine, Sasha threw open the door and ran towards the cabin, her breath coming in frantic puffs of mist. But before she could knock, the door swung open, and Carl stood there, his sharp gaze flickering between her and Grizzly. He didn't need to ask. He could see it all over their faces. "What happened?" His voice was low and steady, but laced with tension. Sasha swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jack and Miguel, their plane went down." Carl's expression barely changed, but his fingers tightened on the door frame. Where? Well, they don't know, Grizzly said grimly, stepping up beside Sasha. Now this is somewhere between Anchorage and Fairbanks. The storms are making it damn near impossible to find them. Carl exhaled slowly, then stepped back, nodding them inside. Come on in, you're not going to do any good standing out in the cold. Sasha hesitated for half a second before stepping into the warmth of the cabin. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee, a place that should have been comforting, but nothing felt right. She paced to the window, wrapping her arms around herself, staring out into the swirling snow as if she could will the storm to clear. Carl shut the door and he turned to Grizzly. Search and rescue on it? Grizzly nodded. Yep, doing what they can, but now they're not going to be able to get out there in force until the weather lets up. Carl's jaw tensed. That could be too late. We know, Sasha snapped, turning to them both, her eyes ablazing. We know that, Carl, but what the hell are we supposed to do? Hope they don't freeze to death before the storm clears? I can't. Her voice cracked. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to take a deep breath. Carl walked over and put his arms around her. Sasha buried her head in his shoulders and sobbed. Grizzly scratched his beard, glancing at Sasha before speaking. Figured you'd want to know, and he hesitated, and then a big sigh. We might need to start thinking about other options. See, if this storm keeps up, they won't be able to search from the air for a while. But if we knew where to look, why, we might be able to... Carl rubbed his chin. His sharp eyes locked into Grizzly's face. You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you? Grizzly exhaled slowly, his breath coming out in a heavy sigh. Well, I know the official search teams are grounded until the storm lets up. But we both know there are folks out here who won't wait for clearance. If we can figure out where that plane went down, we might have a shot at getting them before it's too late. Sasha turned from the window, desperation flickering in her eyes. And how do we do that? They don't even know where to start looking. Carl nodded towards the radio sitting on his kitchen table. Well, maybe they don't, but there's always chatter on the airwaves. There's pilots, there's bush guides, there's trappers. Somebody might have seen something. If that plane went down anywhere near a cabin or a hunting camp, word will spread fast. Grizzly grunted, and that's what I was thinking. We need to reach out to the right people, the guys who don't give a damn about waiting for permission. Sasha didn't even hesitate. Then let's do it. Carl grabbed a hold of the radio, adjusting the frequency with practiced ease before keying the mic. Yeah, this is Coyote Carl out of Fairbanks. Need any pilot or backcountry boys monitoring the airwaves to check in. We got a plane down somewhere between Anchorage and Fairbanks. Repeat, plane down. If anyone's seen or heard anything, speak up. Both Sasha and Grizzly raised an eyebrow at Carl's handle. Coyote Carl? Why, that was something neither one had heard before. They waited, tension thick in the air. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by silence. Sasha clenched her fist, willing someone, anyone, to respond. Now, after several minutes had passed, with several more attempts by Coyote Carl, a voice broke through. Hey, this is Hank the Tank out by the Tanana River. Thought I saw something before the storm rolled in. Looked like a fireball dropping out of the sky west of the ridge. I'll do my best to make it over to that direction. Sasha sucked in a sharp breath. Grizzly and Carl exchanged looks. West of the ridge. Well, that wasn't much, but it was a start. Carl's cabin was close enough to Fairbanks to get cell reception. He phoned the Fairbanks airport and asked for the number of the person in charge of the search and rescue. Now, after several attempts, he finally got through to Chuck Larson. Chuck, Chuck, we've got an anonymous tip that a plane was seen going down just over the West Ridge by the Tanana River. Carl relayed that info to him. Chuck was used to getting anonymous tips from bush pilots that flew under radar and knew the routine. You don't ask no questions, you simply write down the information and thank the fellow for calling in. Okay then, thank you for the info, and we'll begin the search over there as soon as we can get wings in the air, Chuck replied. Now, any idea who the pilot was, Carl asked. Yep, it was Sam Anderson, carrying 14 passengers. You have a good day now, and let me know if you hear or see anything else. Carl hung up that phone and took a deep sigh. He knew Sam, and he also knew that if anyone could have navigated that rough storm, it would have been him. If Sam's plane went down, then the conditions were worse than anyone could have imagined. Well, what do we do now? Sasha asked. Do we wait here or we drive on into Fairbanks? Carl led Sasha over to the large lounge chair next to the wood stove and told her to sit down. I'm going to make some coffee. We may as well stay right here where we have phone service and the radio in case any more sightings come in. Now I'll keep reaching out to the bush pilots and all the trappers I know in the area. Carl busied himself making phone calls and alerting anyone he knew with snowmobiles and dog sleds, men who knew that territory outside of Fairbanks better than anyone else. He trusted the men he was calling more than the so-called official rescue teams. The storm would slow them down, ground the helicopters, but the men Carl had in mind, the ones who had spent their lives tracking the wild, yeah, they knew how to move through this land with the precision of wolves on a hunt. Get the snowmobiles ready, Carl growled into the phone. We're going to need every one of them you can spare. We're heading out to find that damned wreck, and I don't care what the weather's doing, as long as these guys are still breathing. You got it? His voice had a gruff edge, but it was laced with an undercurrent of fear that he wasn't sure he could hide. The storm was a force to be reckoned with, and the landscape between Fairbanks and the wreckage was very unforgiving. The snow was already piling up in high drifts, and the visibility was close to zero. He wasn't just worried about the storm. He was worried about what they might find when they reached the wreck. At the wreckage site, curled against each other for warmth was not enough to keep the seriously injured alive. By morning, only 6 of the original 14 passengers remained. The brutal storm had stolen the weakest among them. Jack forced himself to his feet, every muscle stiff and aching. Miguel was crouching beside the fire, his face lined with exhaustion as he desperately tried to keep the fire going with any remnants of the plane that would burn. The flames had dwindled, barely more than embers now, and they needed more fuel, more warmth. Jack could see the pain etched across Miguel's face. He'd lost a lot of blood from that gash on his forehead, and Jack suspected that he just might well have broken a few ribs as well. He could see Miguel grimace every time he bent down to tend the fire or tried to help one of the other passengers. Jack scanned the survivors. A middle-aged woman, her face hollow with grief, clutched a torn airline blanket around her shoulders, muttering prayers under her breath. A young man with a broken arm sat in stunned silence, staring at nothing, while another woman rocked back and forth, eyes red-rimmed from a night of quiet sobs. The young girl that Miguel had originally noticed sat with her head on her knees, sobbing silently, both of her parents dead. Miguel exhaled sharply, putting a hand on his rib cage. We need to find food, something better for shelter, something to block these open gaps that let in all the cold in. Jack nodded. The fuselage had offered some protection, but the wreckage was still exposed, still dangerous. They needed a better plan if they were going to last another night. The truth was a stark reality. If help didn't come soon, they weren't going to make it out alive. Together, Jack and Miguel dragged the passengers that had died during the night outside into the snow where the other dead were laying. It was the middle of February, and they all knew what this meant this far north. The weak glow of morning would give them only a few short hours before the long, merciless night crept in again. Jack knew that they had to act fast. That fire wasn't going to last forever, and without food or better shelter, their chances of surviving another night were slim. The reality of their situation was settling in. A middle-aged woman, her face drawn and pale, clutched a coat tightly around her. "How long do you think before they find us?" Jack hesitated before answering. "Could be today, could be days from now. Depends on whether they got our last coordinates before we went down." He didn't say what they were all thinking. If the storm had scrambled their signal, no one would know where to look. The young girl held up a dented metal case. "I found some rations. Not much, but enough to stretch out if we're careful, and I have some trail mix and some water in my backpack." Jack nodded. "Good. Keep looking through the bags. We're going to need anything that'll keep us alive." Animals are naturally curious, and it didn't take long for the dead bodies outside in the snow, even though they were frozen, began to attract visitors. The first to arrive were the ravens, their dark silhouettes stark against the swirling snow. They perched on the twisted remnants of the fuselage, their beady black eyes surveying the wreckage with knowing intelligence. The harsh croaks echoed through the cold air as they hopped closer, pecking at the still forms lying half buried in the drifted snow. Not far behind, a lone fox slinked along the tree line, its rust-colored coat dusted with frost. It paused, sniffing the air, ears twitching. The scent of death carried far in the bitter wind, and though the fox was cautious, hunger always won out over fear. It crept forward, its delicate paws barely making a sound as it neared the edge of the crash site. Then came the wolves. At first it was just one, gray, lean, moving with the confidence of a predator that knew it had nothing to fear. It prowled along the outskirts, its breath a ghostly mist in the frigid air. A second soon followed, then a third, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the overcast sky. They weren't desperate yet, not yet. But they had picked up the scent of blood, and the instinct had told them where there was death, there was a meal. Inside the scattered remains of the plane, Jack stirred. His body ached, stiff and frozen, his breath shallow in the freezing air. The wind howled through the broken fuselage, and he swore he could hear something else beneath it. Low growls, the snap of twigs, the distant rustling of something moving just beyond the wreckage. He could feel his own wild nature stirring at their call. Survival had just become even more complicated. Yet it also gave Jack an idea. Jack knew what he had to do. The crash had left them with barely any supplies, and the cold was relentless, sinking its teeth into their bones and threatening to snuff out their lives. The injured needed food and warmth and hope. If they waited for rescue, they might be waiting too long. And now, with wolves lurking just beyond the wreckage, he realized there was an opportunity hidden within the danger. It would be a risk, but it was the only choice he had. He pushed himself up with a grimace, his muscles stiff from the cold. Every movement felt sluggish, as if ice had settled into his bones. Miguel, huddled near the remains of the cockpit with a few other survivors, looked up as Jack stood. "Where are you going?" Jack met his friend's gaze, steady despite the storm raging in his gut. "I need to hunt." Miguel frowned. "Jack, you can barely stand." "I won't be in this form for long." Understanding flickered in Miguel's eyes, followed by concern. There was no time to argue. Right now, all that mattered was making sure they lived through the night. Jack stepped carefully through the jagged tear in the fuselage, the wind immediately biting into his exposed skin like shards of glass. The snow swirled violently, cutting visibility to mere feet. His breath came in a rapid, shuddering cloud, and he already felt the body protesting. But he had no choice. With trembling fingers, he unzipped his jacket and let it slide from his shoulders. The cold hit him like a hammer. His body convulsed, muscles locking up in protest. But he forced himself to keep going. Shirt, boots, pants, one by one, the layers dropped into the snow, vanishing beneath the fresh dusting of weight. His bare skin burned with the intensity of the cold, his fingers already losing feeling. He had to shift now, before the cold stopped his heart. Jack closed his eyes and called the wolf. At first, nothing happened. Just his own ragged breathing and the wind screaming around him. Then the familiar pull, the snapping and the stretching of sinew and bone as the changes were ripped through him. It hurt, more than usual. His body weakened from the crash, the cold making his transformation sluggish. But then, relief. His limbs lengthened, his senses sharpened, and in mere second, where Jack once stood, a massive wolf now crouched in the snow. The cold air nipped at his fur, but it no longer threatened to steal his breath. His heart pounded with renewed strength, and his eyes cut through the darkness with ease. He sniffed the air, sorting through the tangled scent. Blood, smoke, fear, until he found what he was looking for. The wolves were still nearby. Jack lowered his head and took off into the storm, a ghost moving through the night. Deep in the frozen forests of the Alaskan wilderness, the Mavka stirred. The ancient forest spirits, deeply tied to the land and the forces of nature, hauntingly beautiful women with their long, flowing hair and ethereal presence, both alluring and terrifying, drifted in and out of the world of spirit and the world of man. From their beginning in Slavic folklore to the modern day, they are known to lure men into the depths of the woods, to steal their heart and their soul. They are vengeful when they are wronged, and fiercely loyal to those that they claim. Miguel had once made a bargain with one of them, and now, as he teetered on the edge of life and death in the frozen Alaskan wilderness, his Mavka heard him call and felt his pain, because once a Mavka claims someone, they are never truly free. The moment the plane had gone down, she had felt it, a sharp, searing pain deep in her chest, as if the very roots that bound her to the earth had been torn apart. Miguel was in danger. Her Miguel, the one who had given his heart and soul to her. Even if he had not understood the weight of his promise, the bond between them was strong, and now it pulled at her with a force that could not be denied. She stepped through the snow, her bare feet leaving no trace, her long hair flowing like river reeds caught in an unseen current. The Mavka turned her gaze toward the northern sky where the storm raged, and the auroras flickered like ghostly fire. She could feel him through the howl of the wind and through the shifting ice, through the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. He was not alone. There were others with him, mortals clinging desperately to life. And there were wolves. She lifted her arms and the trees shivered in response. The wind changed course, bending to her will. The spirits of the forest listened when she called, and now they would lead her to him. The others were already gathering, summoned by the same call that had sent an aching pulse through her surrounding forest. They emerged from the trees, their luminous eyes glowing against the darkness, their whispers weaving through the wind like an eerie melody. They would not let him die in this bitter, forsaken land. He belonged to the forest now, whether he accepted it or not. And the forest always claimed what was hers. The others followed, their movements soundless, their presence unseen by those who did not know where to look. They would find Miguel. They would bring him home. And if anything, anyone stood in their way, The forest itself would rise to tear it apart. The Mavka moved like a shadow through the trees, their presence barely more than a whisper against the howling wind. The storm was their ally, its fury hiding them from mortal eyes. With each step they sank deeper into the fabric of the land, sensing every shift in the frozen earth, every heartbeat of the creatures that roamed beneath the snow-laden boughs. Their leader, his Mavka, closed her eyes and exhaled, sending her awareness spiraling outward like unseen tendrils. She reached for him, for the thread that connected them beyond the limits of flesh and time. A tremor passed through her as she felt his pain, cold and sharp, wrapping around him like the deathly grip of winter itself. He was fading, his body weakened from the crash and from the relentless ice that thought to claim him. Her fingers curled into fists. "No, I will not lose him. We must move faster," one of the others whispered, sensing the urgency in their sister's clenched hands. The leader nodded once, then turned to the spirits that lurked in the depths of the trees. They had been watching and waiting. They had no faces, no true form, only shifting shapes of mist and shadow that pulsed out between the trunks, their presence rippling the air like a shudder through the earth. "Go," she commanded. "Find him." The spirits scattered, vanishing into the storm, riding the wind towards the wreckage. They would seek him out first, mapping the landscape of the crash, tracing the scent of his blood. They would whisper his location back to her, guiding the Mavka to where he lay on the edge of survival. She pressed her hand against the nearest tree, her fingers sinking into the bark like it was flesh. The ancient roots stirred beneath the snow, groaning as they twisted and coiled through the frozen ground. If Miguel's body failed him before they arrived, she would not let him slip into death. The land itself would hold him. The roots of the forest would cradle his body, keeping him from being swallowed by the ice. The others watched, their glowing eyes reflecting the eerie light of the storm. "And the wolf?" one of them asked after a moment, her voice lilting like wind through brittle leaves. The leader's lips curled, the ghost of a smile, cold and knowing. "The wolf is not our concern," she said, "unless he stands in our way." The others exchanged glances, their pale faces unreadable. They moved as one, vanishing into the storm, their steps soundless as they cut through the vast frozen wilderness. Miguel was waiting, and they were coming for him.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, have a great week, everyone.
Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.